Why bother with history? An introduction to the study of the history of psychology. For Psych 182, History and Systems of Psychology. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Welcome to Psych 182. This is the History of Psychology course. Now, many of you have dreaded this course. I know some students leave it till the very end, but I hope to give you a very enjoyable experience over the next several weeks, and I hope that you're going to learn to have a greater appreciation for the history of our field. We'll put history in the context of things that are going on historically, although we're going to move very quickly because we only have a few weeks to cover several thousand years of philosophy, physiology, psychology, and other related areas. One thing I want to assure you of is that in our study of history, we're not going to focus on memorizing dates and extraneous things like that. I'm far more interested in having you learn the ideas and how the ideas they have ebbed and flowed. I'll make you memorize one date. You can start working on it right now. That's 1879. 1879 is the formal founding of our field by Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany. It's the only date I'm going to have you worry about, although I'll put many other dates in the PowerPoints. They're primarily for historical value. I don't really care if you knew that Plato lived at a certain time. All I care is that you know that he was an ancient Greek, which gives you lots of latitude there. Also, one thing that I want to try to convince you of as we go through this course this semester is that history isn't about nonsense things like dates and memorizing facts and geographical locations and things like that. Ever since we've been able to communicate with each other, we've talked about the behavior of other people in our species. And we've also worried about the psychology of other species. So if you're truly a psychologist at heart, and your goal is to learn about the study of behavior, I want you to look at this class in the same light. It's about how people have viewed the study of behavior over time. Now, I will talk about some very interesting ideas that the Greeks developed that we still talk about to this day. We'll also talk about some kind of silly ideas that didn't make it, but it's important to look at them anyway. We'll see some themes like the constant debate between nature and nurture. Do we get ideas from our inner psyche or are they all external? So, let's start our journey. I like quotes. Let's start by talking about a few quotes that give you some context in studying history. This video primarily is concerned with philosophical ideas about the study of history. After that, we'll move on to more substantive topics. But take this as the introduction to the introduction of the study of the history of psychology. George Santayana says, those who cannot repeat George Santayana says those that cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's probably the most widely used quote on studying history. I've found several others that I like to use as well. Cicero, the Greek scholar, says to be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. For what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into, the life of our ancestors by the records of history. Had to look around my video camera, sorry. Churchill. The further backward you can look, the further forward you are likely to see. Along similar veins, Confucius said, study the past if you would like to define the future. And a more recent quote from the economist Thomas Sowell, one of the most important reasons for studying history is that virtually every stupid idea that has been invoked today has been tried before and proved disastrous time and time again. I like that one especially. And if you've seen all the stupid ideas that are out there, you'll know why that one becomes critically important. Finally, a cartoon. If history repeats itself, why can't we just learn about the first 100 years or so? That's probably your view starting this course. I hope that by the end of this course, you're going to see things a little bit differently, maybe more like I see them in terms of the importance of history. Well, why should we bother studying history? A lot of you have taken history classes, found them dreadfully god-awful, boring sets of facts and figures. Hopefully we'll get around that in this class. History helps us understand people and societies, according to Peter Stearns, who is a historian that has studied how historians study history. Also, have to understand change and how society came to be the way it is. Why do we have the issues that we have today? Why do we have problems? Have we seen things over and over again? And how did these changes come about? Gain an understanding of the importance of history in our own lives. This one may be a stretch, but do you want to repeat errors other people made in the past? I remember in graduate school walking across campus during the first couple of weeks, and I was walking across with a colleague who obviously never had a course in the history of psychology. By the time that we walked across campus, he told me what he wanted to do in his research program, and I kept my tongue quiet there because he was talking about something that didn't work in the 1860s. Didn't end up working for him either, but if he knew his history, maybe he would have picked up on some different ideas. History contributes to moral understanding. Why did people do certain things? Why did people treat people certain ways at certain points in history? And we'll talk about this in the context of how individuals were treated, how women were treated, how, at least until we get to a later time, slaves were considered and treated. How have our views changed on these things? History provides an individual with an identity. One of the big things that I take away from the study of history is my identity as a psychologist, as someone who belongs to a group of people who have studied the behavior of our species since we pretty much could communicate with each other. And studying history is good citizenship. Well, this isn't a citizenship class, but maybe this will make you a better citizen of psychology. What skills does a student of history develop? Well, first of all, the ability to assess evidence. And we'll look at a lot of contradictory views, things that constantly are changing and swinging back and forth like a pendulum. For example, the notion of nature versus nurture. That's a pendulum that's been swinging constantly in the study of human behavior. Now it's swung pretty much to the nurture side, where we think that everything is genetic and everything is biological. When I was a student, behaviorism was strong, and the idea of biology affecting behavior, well, that was thought to be a trivial thing. The ability to assess conflicting interpretations. Why do some people think a certain way at a certain time? How do those views change? That's an important thing to think about. What skills do we develop as a student? Well, we get experience in assessing past examples of change. Why did some ideas fall out of favor? Why did other ideas replace them? It's going to be an important part of our story of the history of psychology. Let's look at some philosophical approaches to studying the history of psychology. And these are going to be important in how we take on studying our field. One major view is presentism. Presentism is the idea that we take something that's going on right now and go back in history and look at why we're thinking that way now. I think the biological movement in studying human behavior is one of those primary things that are affected by presentism. Right now, we're looking for genetic influences on everything, and we can go back and look at where biological approaches were viable and where they weren't. Another view of history, and this is the one that we'll kind of fall into with this class, it's called the great person approach to history. This historically has changed. It used to be the great man, but now it's the great person. And this has to do with examining history as it revolves around the lives and contributions of seminal individuals in a field. So, for example, in Enlightenment era, well, post-Enlightenment era, I should say, Europe, we have the Napoleonic era, and it's marked by Napoleon's contributions to changing Europe in terms of things like everything from law to how the map looked and things like that. Now, to me, the best way of studying history is to study it through something I'm sure you've heard before in other classes. I think we all just like saying the word, to be honest with you. And that's the Zeitgeist. Zeitgeist, roughly translated, is the spirit of the times. It's one of those German words that doesn't translate really, really well to English. But when we look at the Zeitgeist, we talk about history being marked by cultural, technological, political, and scientific events of a certain time and era. For example, it wouldn't have done much good to come up with a cognitive view of psychology based on information processing and computers before computers were around. In fact, now we're kind of past that notion that our brains work as simplistically as computers do. But we have to have the technology in place to be able to study something. Before DNA, we weren't able to study genetic effects that well. We could speculate about them, but you need those kinds of things: political, social, social psychology, behaviorism, really, really big up through the 70s and early 80s, primarily fueled by the movement to look at things in terms of social movements going on in our country and things like that. And then finally, there's historism. Historism is simply studying history for the sake of studying history. It's because you enjoy it. As I said in my introductory remarks, I'm a closet historian. If I would have known that when I grew up I could be a professor type person, I might have been a historian, because I love history and I love learning about the past. So, this is our first introductory notes in history. We'll move on in the next unit to talk about some ideas of scientific development. So, now you have a basic understanding of why we should study history. In our next unit, we'll talk about scientific developments and how those work. Eventually, we'll get to the history part, I promise. When we do, we're going to move pretty fast. Hang on. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved. See you next time.